Welcome everybody to London Futurists, where we're going to be looking at surprises, or surprises that in retrospect can be seen as predictable surprises. Or we're going to be looking at how we can avoid just discovering in hindsight that we shouldn't have taken various steps. How can we change our thinking methods so that we get the benefit of that hindsight beforehand as a possible foresight, so we are less likely to be constrained by our current inappropriate or limited thinking. And the world very much needs better types of thinking systems, because the world is facing more change than ever before, more complications, more convergence of different forces. We also need it because businesses are struggling to keep up with the pace of change. I think some of what you're going to hear today is very relevant for anybody concerned about the future of their business, to avoid their businesses being the victims of what in retrospect might be seen as predictable surprises. It's also relevant for us as individuals. Are we on a particular trajectory in our lives that made sense, but perhaps in retrospect we should be having a different set of ideas? And finally, I think this sort of thinking is very relevant for the world as a whole, because the challenges facing the world as a whole, society, humanity, are in some ways different from what they've been in the past. We don't want just to refight the previous battle, we need to be ready for the new battle. And happily, we have with us today a speaker who has given a great deal of his time in the last few years to helping organisations of all sorts make this kind of transition in their thinking. I believe he's going to share with you some success stories as well, probably as some failure stories, and what we can all do to learn from them. So let's give a warm welcome to somebody who's come all the way from America, not this morning I think, but in the last few days. He'll tell you more about his own background and his own ideas. Let's welcome Bryce Hoffman.
Thank you very much. So, the point that I want to start with is that there's a quote, it's often attributed to Einstein, unfortunately it's not from Einstein, that we can't solve our problems with the same thinking that we used to create them. It's actually been sourced to a early 20th century industrial thinker whose name nobody remembers anymore, so it sounds a lot better when we attribute it to Einstein. But the intent is very spot on, which is that when we try to look at problems, especially complex problems, especially the sort of problems that we have to overcome if the future is going to be better than it is better than things look right now, requires us to change our thinking. You can't see the future by looking at the future with the same thinking that you looked at the past, and you can't change the future without changing your thinking. But the question is, that's easy to say, but how do you do it? So a little bit about my background. I'm a former journalist, former financial journalist. I first step in solving your problem is admitting you have one. And so I was a journalist, and I haven't written a story in 5 years, so got that under my belt. But I've been working for the past 5 years on trying to find ways to help companies and organizations in general think differently about the future and think differently about strategies and plans and how to make them more successful. And the way that I've come up with doing this is to take a strategy, to take a methodology that was developed by the military and intelligence community, first in the United States and secondly in the United Kingdom, after 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan started to fall apart. They created a system called red teaming. And they created this system because they recognized that the thinking that they had used to plan these wars was really deeply flawed. And that the failures that occurred in Iraq and Afghanistan were the result of not challenging their own assumptions, about thinking about these, at the point they were planning them, future conflicts through the lens of past experience. And so in order to make sure they didn't fall into the same trap in the future, they created a system they called red teaming. And I'll talk in a bit about where the science behind red teaming, but red teaming is really based on a lot of recent developments in neurobiology, in cognitive psychology, and just the human decision-making process in general. But it goes back even deeper than that, and it really starts, if you look at the history of it, with this gentleman who I think is probably the best named pope in history, Pope Sixtus V, not to be confused with Pope Fifthus VI. And Pope Sixtus V was the pope at the beginning of the early Renaissance, and he had a problem, and the problem that he had was too many saints. There were already hundreds of saints, and hundreds of new ones were being created every year, or at least proposed every year. And just managing the calendar of feast days had become an unruly task for the church. And so Pope Sixtus V decided, well, there's this new thing called rational thinking that's everyone's talking about. Maybe we should try a little bit of it and apply it to this issue of creating saints. And so he created an office that still exists today. Most people don't realize that this is a real thing. He created the office of the Advocatus Diaboli, or the Devil's Advocate. And the office of the Devil's Advocate, which is a actual office in the Vatican, is held by a canon lawyer, a priest who's trained in church law. And his job was to take every male and female who was nominated for sainthood and try to, with his team of other canon lawyers, argue that their supposed good deeds were really just blatant self-promotion, and their supposed miracles had rational scientific explanations. So can anyone guess what happened once the Devil's Advocate started his work and started presenting the counterclaims to sainthood?
They significantly reduced the number of possible saints.
By over 90%. And it stayed that low up till the present day. Yes, sir?
I just want to make a point, because I came across it in the news recently. The most recent saint, I think, was beatified in the last few days.
Oh.
And he's British.
Ah.
Today, Cardinal Newman.
Ah.
Newman.
So he must have passed the Devil's Advocate test. Well, Mother Teresa was another recent saint, and the Devil's Advocate called the famous atheist Christopher Hitchens to testify against her. Now, Hitchens later complained that he wasn't compensated for his testimony, so that therefore he had represented the devil pro bono. He also lost. But but this is really the first time in history, at least in my research, you can find an instance of an organization that makes a conscious decision that we're going to challenge our own assumptions. We're going to challenge our own beliefs. We're going to argue against ourselves as a matter of policy and as a matter of process. And I think that's really important. So let's fast forward a little bit here to the late 1700s, early 1800s. Now, the Prussians had a different problem. They'd just been beaten by Napoleon. And, a lot of countries had been beaten by Napoleon, as we know at that point, but it was particularly bad for the Prussians because they kind of fancied themselves to be the greatest military nation in the history of the world. So it particularly smarted. And the Prussians went back, and they had a very frank conversation amongst themselves, the Prussian generals. And they said, look, Hans, Fritz, let's be honest with ourselves. None of us is the equal of Napoleon. But Gunther over there, he knows cavalry just as well as Napoleon does. And Hans here, he knows logistics just as well as Napoleon does. So rather than asking the king to appoint a new general to lead our rebuilding the Prussian army, let's have him pick the best general for each area. And we'll have a team of generals who will lead the Prussian army, and we'll call it the general staff. And the Prussians did that, but they didn't stop there. They then said, it's great, we've got this general staff now, but before we go and try to rise up and attack Napoleon again with our British allies, why don't we test our ideas out and make sure that we could really beat him? Because if we fail, we won't get a second chance. So they said, how will we do this? We'll play this out on a tabletop, and it'll be a game, a Kriegspiel, war gaming. Now, how many of you had Crayola crayons as children? Anybody? Do you remember Prussian blue? One of my favorite colors in the set. So Prussian blue was so called because the Prussians wore these very spiffy blue uniforms. So they, of course, were the blue team. Then they picked the second best group of officers to pretend that they were the revolutionary French, so they were the red team. And that's where the idea, the term red team and red teaming comes from. And it worked. They beat the French at Jena, and then with the coalition forces definitively at Waterloo. And the system was so successful that the British, the Americans, pretty much every major nation on earth over the next 50 years adopted both the general staff system and this concept of wargaming and this idea of having a red team. So, jumping ahead again to the Yom Kippur War in Israel in 1973. Now, this is if anyone is interested in the topic of failures of imagination, you would be hard-pressed to find a better case study to read than the lead up to the Yom Kippur War. So the Israelis had more intelligence, more information telling them that they were about to be invaded than probably any country in the history of the world has ever had. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. They had intercepted electronic transmissions between Egypt and Syria saying what time the invasion was going to happen. They knew that the Russians, who were allies of the Egyptians and Syrians, had sent all of their fleets to sea and ordered all of their diplomats home from Cairo and Damascus. They had a mole in the Egyptian general staff who told them the place the invasion would start, the code name of the invasion, the exact moment the invasion would be launched, and they had soldiers on the front lines looking at with binoculars across the Suez Canal who could see Egyptian soldiers bringing up bridging equipment across the Suez Canal. And despite all of this, and a lot more that I'm not talking about, and one I will, because it's hard to imagine this actually happened, but if you look it up, it did. King Hussein of Jordan actually flew to Golda Meir's house, landed in her backyard in his personal helicopter and said, "Madam Prime Minister, why you're about to be invaded? Why are you not calling up your reserves?" And the answer was, because we're smarter than that. We're smarter than that. We know this is a trick. The Arabs had moved troops to the border several times over the past several years, and every time they did, the Israelis would call up their reserves, and every time they called up their reserves, their economy would kind of grind to a halt because every man and woman in Israel was a member of the military, and they weren't going to fall for it this time. And the reason that they weren't going to fall for it is because they believed that they had cracked the Arab code. And when I say crack the Arab code, I don't mean the Arab ciphers, because they'd done that a long time ago. They thought they had understood the mind of their enemy, and what they understood was so certain. They were so certain of, they started referring to it as the concept, with a capital C. And the concept held two things: one, that Syria would never attack them without Egypt, and two, that Egypt would never attack them unless the Egyptian Air Force believed it could destroy the Israeli Air Force, because the previous two wars they'd fought had all failed because of air power. And so they spent all of their time studying the Egyptian Air Force and having spies in the Egyptian Air Force. And they knew the Egyptian Air Force didn't believe it could defeat the Israeli Air Force. And so they knew that this was nothing to worry about. And then, of course, they were invaded. Well, what had happened was, while they were so focused on the concept, with a capital C, the Soviets had developed mobile surface-to-air missiles, and they had sold them to Egypt for very cheap. And the Egyptians had bought hundreds of them. And these mobile surface-to-air missiles could roll forward with the Egyptian army and protect them. They didn't need an air force to protect them anymore. But the Israelis were so focused on their concept that they didn't even notice this, even though it was not even secret. The shipments were public knowledge. So, after they almost were defeated in the Yom Kippur War, they said, what are we going to do to make sure this never happens again? And the answer was to create a group within Israeli military intelligence, and it still exists today, and it's called Ipsa Mitzabra, which I don't speak Aramaic, but I'm told in Aramaic means, on the contrary, the opposite is true. And their motto is a riff on the SAS's motto, he who dares wins, is he who thinks wins. And the job of this group is very simple. They take whatever the prevailing conclusions are of Israeli military intelligence about what's happening in the world, and they argue that the opposite is true. Now they argue the opposite is true not necessarily because it is, but because by arguing that the opposite is true, they force planners to challenge their own thinking about what's going to happen in the future. And by challenging their thinking, they're able to change their plans and make them more able to deal with the uncertainty of the future. So that is how we kind of get to modern red team. Now, the US had a similar failure of imagination on September 11th, 2001. The Central Intelligence Agency and other US intelligence agencies had tons of information that said that the US was about to be attacked by terrorists. And when I say tons of information, I mean as specific as the head of a flight school in Florida calling the FBI and saying, I just want to let you know, I've got a class full of guys from the Middle East who want to learn how to fly jumbo jets, but they don't want to learn how to land. And by the way, they've asked specifically that all the simulations take place over New York City. I just thought that was a little odd and you might want to know. Despite that, those people weren't even tracked. And so on September 12th, 2001, the director of the CIA, George Tenet, recognized that they had had a colossal failure of imagination and determined that they weren't going to repeat it. So he created something called the Red Cell. And the Red Cell was basically an American version of the Israeli organization, and it still exists, and it exists within the CIA. And its job is, just like the Israelis, to take whatever the prevailing wisdom of the CIA is and argue that it's wrong. Or to argue that the intelligence that they're gathering could be interpreted in a completely different way. And then to look at what the ramifications of that different interpretation would be. Now, most of the work of the Red Cell is obviously very classified, and so we can't really talk about it, but one part of it is very public, and that's that starting about 2 weeks after September 11th, the Red Cell began producing every day a single double-sided sheet of paper for the President of the United States called the Alternative Intelligence Assessment. And this was given to the President as part of his daily briefing book, which consisted of 6 pages of intelligence analysis saying, here's what's happening everywhere in the world today, here's what it means for the United States, here's what your options are to deal with it. And then he was given, at the back of it, this appendix with 2 pages saying, this could all be wrong. And if it's wrong, here's the implications of it being wrong, and here's some other things for you to think about. Now, you can make of this what you will. Both President Bush and President Obama both said they found this document to be one of the most valuable things they read every day. President Trump, on his second week in office, said he found it confusing and asked it to be removed from his briefing. And the CIA still prepares it, they just don't give it to the president. Not that it would make any difference if they did. But that was the beginning of red teaming in the United States, really, but it didn't stop there, because the Army in the United States quickly found that it was falling victim to its own failure of imagination. And its failure of imagination went like this. We thought we won the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now suddenly we're losing them. How did this happen? And they created a huge lessons learned team to figure out how this happened. And the lessons learned team, one of the heads of it was an intelligence officer who had a very strange meeting right before the war started. And his meeting was with this gentleman, Sayed Abdul-Majid Al-Qawi. You can't tell because I blocked him with my text, but that's actually Tony Blair's hand there. About a month before the war in Iraq started, the CIA took him and some generals to meet with this gentleman, picked them up in the middle of the night in a windowless van and took them to a warehouse on the outskirts of Kuwait City, where another windowless van came and deposited this gentleman. And they said, this is going to be our man in Iraq. And we brought him here for you all to fine-tune your plans before the invasion. You can ask, it was an ask me anything with a leading Shiite cleric. And so they asked him anything. And they asked him the sort of things you'd expect generals to ask, like, can we get tanks in Basra? Are the roads wide enough? Do you think Saddam will blow the dams that in southern Iraq and flood the south of the country to slow us down? Here's these cool propaganda leaflets we've made. Do you think they'll work? And he answered their questions, but the gentleman who was observing this noticed that he was getting a lot less patient with each question. And finally, after about an hour, Imam Al-Qawi raised his hand and he said, I've answered your questions. I have one question for you, though, before we continue. They said, sure, ask us anything. So my question to you is very simple. Once you've toppled Saddam Hussein, how long are you going to stay in my country? Now, the generals completely misinterpreted this question. They said, don't worry. We've got this all figured out. You're just like France, in 1944, the French, you've got an educated population, you've got industry, you've got oil. French didn't even have oil. We've got a timetable. Once we take Baghdad, within 6 months, the last American and British soldiers will leave the country except for a few trainers. We'll turn it over to you, we'll get out of your way, and you can rebuild your country. He lives dead silence for a long, painful minute after this. And then Imam al-Khoi said, Saddam killed my father. Saddam imprisoned my mother when she was 78 years old. Saddam ordered my sister raped. And he goes on for the next 10 minutes listing all of the things that Saddam Hussein had personally done to his family. And when he was done, he said, I'm telling you all of this so you don't make any mistake that I am a friend of Saddam Hussein's. But having told you all of this, I have one favor to ask you. Get back in your van, drive back to your base, take your tanks, tank your planes, and leave. Stop this. This is going to, if you do what you're saying you're going to do, what you are going to unleash is going to be 1,000 times worse than Saddam Hussein. He said, you think this is going to be France in 1944 with pretty girls throwing flowers at your feet? He says, this is going to be Tito's Yugoslavia the day after Tito died. Everyone is going to kill everyone else. And for the next hour, he proceeded to tell them everything they hadn't considered about how the no offense, but the British had turned Shiite versus Sunni very effectively when they ruled Iraq, and how that wound was still very open, how the country was divided by tribes, how everyone kept a Kalashnikov rifle in the floor underneath their bed, how there were all these underground criminal networks and tribal networks that could be activated and used. And when they were done, they had a very awkward drive back to the base. And they wrote up a memo that said, maybe we should reconsider this because there's a lot that we haven't taken into account. And that memo went to General Dunford, who was in charge of Allied forces, and he read it and he sent it to President Bush and Tony Blair. And no one knows what happened to that memo after that, but nothing changed, obviously. But in the 2 years later, when everything was kind of running off the tracks, somebody remembered that memo, and they asked the colonel who'd written it to lead one of the lessons learned team to figure out how they could avoid this in the future. And so what he recommended was this idea. He knew about what the Israelis had done. He knew about what the Prussians had done. He didn't know about what the Catholic Church had done, but I told him. And he came up with this system that he called red teaming, and proposed that the military create teams of people throughout the organization whose job would be to look at whatever the plan or strategy was and try to show how it could fail, to try to challenge the underlying assumptions of this strategy or plan, not to come up with a different strategy, but to make that strategy better. And to do it before it was too late to change your mind. Key point. So, the US launched this, and it was so immediately effective that Britain then decided to create its own red teaming program. So at MOD Shrivenham, they created a red teaming institute that exists to this day and trains red teams and does red teaming exercises for the MOD. British intelligence has red teams, and then allied militaries throughout the world like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all set up their own red teams. And then even NATO decided to set up its own red teams, but they said, this whole idea of teams is a little bit too confrontational, so we'll call it alternative analysis. So they have an alternative analysis program. So that's when I found out about it. I said, wow, this is really effective, because red teaming, I could see, was proven set of tools that helped organizations to make better decisions, to stress test their strategies, improve their plans, identify unseen threats and missed opportunities. It also was a way of institutionalizing contrarian thinking. A lot of people love the concept of contrarian thinking, but they don't have any idea how to A, be contrarian thinkers, or or see how to incorporate it into their organization. And yet the world is changing so rapidly that you kind of need to. And then finally, and this is where we kind of get into the futuring part of this, is it also includes a set of tools and techniques, which I'll talk about in a moment, that are designed to help organizations figure out the different ways that the future could unfold so that they can see how this could impact their strategy positively or negatively. So it's really important. It's not just about preventing failure, it's also about increasing success. So, as I mentioned, it is based on the research that's been done in the past 40 years in the area of cognitive decision making by people like Nobel Prize winning psychologist Dr. Daniel Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky, and Dr. Gary Klein and others who have really done pioneering work in this area of how we think and how we make decisions, more importantly, as human beings. Now, what those scientists have found in thousands and thousands of experiments is that Adam Smith was wrong. So for about 3 centuries, Adam Smith's belief, which he postulated in the 1700s, has been the dominant and accepted view of how people make decisions. And that belief is which is called rational choice theory, is that we all make the best decision we can possibly make in any given circumstance, unless 2 things happen. One is we don't have the right information or enough information to make a good decision, or because we're swayed by a strong emotion like anger or an unhealthy obsession with tulips. And otherwise, we're brilliant. We make great decisions except for those 2 things. But the reality is that's not how we make decisions at all. And what Kahneman and others have found is that that's how we think we make decisions, but the real way we make decisions is to kind of fall back unconsciously onto a whole array of biases and heuristics that shape our thinking in complex and unpredictable ways. And they found that we all fall victim to these biases and heuristics, no matter how smart we are, no matter how well educated we are, no matter how successful we are. In fact, the more successful we are, the more likely we are in many cases to fall victim to these. And I'll give you one proof point of that. They've done an analysis of mutual funds in the United States and the UK, and they found that over the last 15 years, about 90% of mutual funds have done worse than if you'd simply deposited your money in the FTSE index or the Dow Jones index and just bought every stock in the market. So how can it be that people get paid millions of dollars or millions of pounds a year to manage these funds, that they don't do as good a job as just randomly throwing money into every bucket? Well, the answer is because they've been successful in the past. And because they've been successful in the past, they think they're going to be successful in the future. And because they think they're going to be successful in the future, they're less likely to challenge their own thinking. So there's a really interesting book written on this that I encourage you to read if you're interested in this topic, called Super Forecasting. And a group of academics have spent the better part of the last 20 years conducting an experiment every single year. And in this experiment, they have 3 groups of people. One group is made up of professional forecasters. And by professional forecasters, I mean people whose job it is to predict the price of oil, the price of gold, the price of, stock X a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. The second group is made up of intelligence analysts from 3-letter agencies in the United States. And they are allowed, for the purpose of this experiment, to access their classified information that they are privy to. And the third group is made up of everyday people, randomly picked, with no educational background, no academic background, no IQ, just random sample of people from an average background. And every year, for almost 20 years, they've given all 3 groups a series of questions. And the questions are very specific. They're things like, will the price of gold exceed 1,100 pounds an ounce by September 14th, 2014? will OPEC vote by October 21st, 2015 to increase oil production? Will the Prime Minister of Tunisia be forced to flee his country by pro-democracy protest within the next 2 years? Very specific questions like this. Can anybody guess what the result every year has been of those? Yes, ma'am.
The random people get it right.
The random people get it right vastly more than the so-called experts, including in the areas that the experts are expert in. So the random people actually do a better job of predicting what the price of oil will be than the people in the group that are actually paid every day to predict what the price of oil will be. So they've drilled down, well, two things. First off, they went to look at why is that? Is it because the experts are stupid? No. It's because the experts have fallen victim to their own success. So they're much less likely than the random people to think deeply about the problem they've been given because they think they already know the answer. Second, they then drilled down and looked at, there was a group of about 10% of the random people who were much more successful than the random people. And so they called them super forecasters. And they went and they looked at what do these people have in common. And it's very interesting. They found that they had two things in common. One was a really solid, innate critical thinking capability. Not any formal tools or techniques, but just they were critical thinkers. They questioned everything. They asked why a lot. The second thing was they doubted themselves. They didn't doubt themselves in a sort of depressive, way that kept them from acting, but they just knew that they didn't know the answers to things in general, and so they were willing to work hard to find them. And so that's because they weren't affected by things like the optimism bias, which is that this belief that I'm better than I think I am. There was a survey done in the UK, and over 80% of British motorists believe that they're good drivers, above average. Another fun fact, in the United States, they did a survey of academics, and they found that across the board, over 90% of college professors believe that they are above average instructors. So clearly, people are not seeing the world as it actually is, or at least most people are. Now, I'm not going to go over all of these, but I'll just touch on a couple more to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. One of my favorite is sunk cost fallacy. This is something that companies fall victim to all the time. So you spend 150 million pounds opening a factory in Argentina, and the factory doesn't make any money. So what do? Yeah, you spend another 50 million pounds to make it make money. Now you've spent 200 million pounds on it, and it's still not making any money. So what do? Spend more money. The government funds a rail project that gets, I know this never happens, 5 years behind schedule. What do? You pour more money into it. And when it's still behind schedule, you pour more money in it. And the reason people pour more money into these things is because they don't want to lose the initial money that they put in. But they'll often spend more money than they initially put in trying to recoup that initial money. It's also why gamblers lose their shirts. Another one I'll touch on is clustering illusion. Now this is a fun one in the UK because this one was actually discovered during World War II during the Blitz. So during the Blitz, the Times of London and I think some of the other papers used to publish a map every day of where the V1 and V2 rockets were striking in London. And people, and I don't mean a couple of people, but hundreds, thousands of people wrote letters to the newspapers with theories about what was going on. And the leading theories were that the neighborhoods that hadn't been hit by V1 and V2 bombs must be the parts of London where all the German spies lived. And then but the most popular theory was that they were striking the East End to inflame class warfare in the United Kingdom by sparing the West End. So, and British intelligence took these theories seriously as well. So when the war ended, they went and they found the German rocket scientists, and they said, well, there's been a great debate over what you were targeting. Which was it? Was it because you were protecting your spies or targeting the East Enders, or what was it? What do you mean? They said, these rockets, we point them in the general vicinity of London, we're lucky if they even make it across the ocean. We're not aiming at anything. They're too primitive.
Thomas Pynchon's Gravity
Yes.
Rainbow takes that as its start.
Exactly.
And pushes it anyway.
Yeah. True. But why do people do that? It's because when we see a group of dots plotted on a map, humans are problem-solving animals. So you give us a problem, the first thing we do is want to solve it. So if you're given a plot every day in the newspaper of dots, you try to figure out what the dots mean, right? It's the same reason that people see religious figures in their burnt toast. You know, we look for patterns where patterns don't exist. And it's just the way our brains are wired. I will do one more that's really one of the most troubling to me, which is, trying to remember which one it is on here, anchoring bias. So anchoring bias is something that real estate agents understand really well, which is the first number that's thrown out in a negotiation sets the frame for the entire negotiation. So if you throw out a really low number, you know, you're less likely to end up with a high number when you're buying a flat or something like that. That's all right. That's fine. That's just shrewd negotiating. But let me tell you how the anchoring bias can be really, really troubling. So Amos Tversky led a study in Germany in the 1980s, 1990s with hundreds of German judges. And the judges were told that they were taking part in a study of sentencing. And they were given a set of dossiers of convicted criminals that described the crime they'd committed. And they were told, what we want you to do is read each of these dossiers and then tell us how much sentence you would give. How many years in prison would you give to each of these people? It's pretty straightforward, right? Except just as they handed the judges to leave and go into the room to look at their folders, they gave them a dice, a 6-sided dice. They said, sorry, could you just roll that dice before you go in the room? Judges were like, sure, why not? The dice were loaded, of course. One set of dice always rolled 6, and one set of dice always rolled 1. Can anybody guess what happened to the judges who rolled 6s? They gave longer sentences. On average, they gave almost 2 years longer per person than the judges who rolled 1. Now, that's troubling, right? But what's even more troubling is when they interviewed the judges later and said, how did the number you rolled on the dice affect your decision making? The vast majority of them couldn't remember having rolled the dice. They didn't even remember that it happened. So think about the implications of that. You might be going to set the price of a new service for an organization, and somebody gets in the lift and says, "Can you press floor 2?" and you're going to floor 90. Now you're going to set a lower price because you've been anchored to a low number. It's really amazing, and we could spend all day talking about these, and I won't, unless you're interested. But the point of it is that that's individuals. Then you put individuals in groups, and you get a whole other layer of kind of skewing of proper thinking that we tend to call groupthink, where we influence each other unduly. But you also get something that's called satisficing, which is the way most organizations make decisions. Is anybody familiar with the term satisficing? Please, sir.
It means that you don't look for the best solution, you just look for a solution which is good enough. So when you go in and choose the food off the menu, you don't look at every single one, you just find the first one that you like and say, well, save time.
Exactly.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is there also something about consensus, looking for consensus more than the right solution?
That is the Abilene paradox.
Yeah.
Very good. So the Abilene paradox is a very confusingly named paradox. It's named after a town in Texas that is very small. Most people have never been there, but presumably is very unpleasant. And it's named this because the psychologist, the organizational psychologist who first identified this, recalled a time when he had been sitting around with his family on a Sunday afternoon, and they were all saying, what should we do with the day? Nobody could think of what they wanted to do with the day. So finally somebody said, well, we could go to Abilene. And then a few minutes later somebody else said, yeah, we could go to Abilene. And then everyone's like, yeah, let's go to Abilene. And then everyone went to Abilene and had a horrible time. And then on the way back in the car, everyone was, why did we go to Abilene? And First person said, we went to Abilene because Jim said he wanted to go to Abilene. And Jim said, I only said I wanted to go to Abilene because Sue said she wanted to go to Abilene. Sue said, I only said I wanted to go to Abilene because it was the only city's name I could think of. Companies and other organizations do this all the time. Abilene paradox is what happens when we say yes when we really mean no. And we say yes because everyone else is saying yes around us. So, and there's a lot of other of these types of things. So red teaming, the tools involved in red teaming are all designed to overcome both the individual biases and the group biases. And at a formal level, it relies, as I mentioned, on setting up a separate team of people. It doesn't have to be a permanent team, it can be an ad hoc team, whose job it is to look at a major decision, a major strategy, a major plan, and challenge it. But it doesn't have to be that. It can also be done more simply as individuals or as small groups, just to think differently about things. But the value of doing it with other people is this. I'll quote another Nobel Prize winning economist. This is one of my favorite quotes. Think about this. One thing nobody can do, no matter how smart they are, is come up with a list of things that would never occur to them. Now it's funny, but it's also very true. And it's actually troubling when you think about that. No matter how hard you think, you can't think of the things that you would never think of. But somebody else could. And it goes to kind of this old Japanese proverb that is, none of us is as smart as all of us. And it's really true when you think about it, because everybody brings something different to the table. Your blind spot is not my blind spot, and my blind spot is not your blind spot. And so if we get together as a group and look at things, we each see something different that can inform us about the reality of the situation. So I was so convinced that all of this was very worthwhile and not just in a military intelligence setting that I asked the Pentagon if I could become the first civilian to go through this red team training program. And initially they told me, why would you think we would let you do that since you're not in the military? And I said, because I'm a best-selling author. And they said, why would you think that would matter? But I'm very persistent, so after 6 months, I finally convinced them to say yes. And I got to go through the program, and I was the first civilian and only civilian to graduate from it. You can tell me here because I'm the only one not wearing camouflage. And then I took and I started using these ideas with businesses. So why would businesses need this? Well, the reason I believe that businesses need these type of tools is because we live in a VUCA world. Is anyone familiar with the term VUCA? Marcus, what is VUCA?
Again, it's come from the military, but it's for the environment that's around us that's changing. It's classed as volatile, uncertain, complex, or ambiguous.
Yes.
A mix of all four.
So volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. In other words, the way the world is today. And the problem with the way that the world is today is our traditional ways of planning, our traditional ways of looking at the future were not created to deal with a world that is that volatile, that is that uncertain, that is that complex, and that is that ambiguous. But red teaming, which was created for the circumstances I described, was created exactly for that world. So that's why I thought it would be valuable for other folks besides people who shoot guns and kill people for a living. So let me give you some examples of why I think that businesses need red teaming. So this is one of my favorite quotes. And for those who don't know, Joe Cassano was the CEO of AIG, which was the financial company that brought down the global economy in 2007, 6 months after this quote was uttered or written. And what he's referring to here is insurance on subprime mortgages. Now, the reason I love this quote is because this quote is not from a press release. This quote is not from an analyst call. This quote is not from an employee town hall meeting. This is from a confidential email that he sent to the other leaders of AIG, marked for eyes only, 6 months before. Far from losing a single dollar from this, they lost the entire company because of this and brought down the global economy with it. And so I think this is really valuable because this gives you amazing insight into how people can fool themselves. These are the lies we tell ourselves. And often with huge and catastrophic consequences. So here's another one. This one actually was from a press conference. Anybody have a Microsoft phone still? No? I guess he was wrong. And I talked with a lot of people who worked at Microsoft then. And this was not just putting a brave face on something. This was really the belief of Steve Ballmer and the other leaders of Microsoft that the iPhone was inconsequential compared to their vastly superior phone that already had plenty of market share. And this one was actually from an analyst call. And the reason I like this one is because this was in response to a Deutsche Bank analyst asking Jim, who was the CEO of Blockbuster, what is your strategy for preventing Netflix and Redbox from continuing to erode your share of the market? And this was his response. We don't have a strategy because they're so insignificant we don't even care about them. Now, fun fact, Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, offered to sell his company to Jim Keyes for $50 million. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And each time he was laughed out of their offices. Now the first time you can understand because Netflix was something that most people hadn't heard of yet, and so you could forgive them for that. The third time that he tried to sell Netflix to Reed Hastings for $50 million, Netflix had already begun to completely destroy their business. And he said, look, we could fight this out and we'll win, but I would rather sit on a beach somewhere, so I'll still take that $50 million and you can have my company and you can change the whole way people watch movies yourselves. And they still laughed him out of the office. Fun fact on that is the day that the last Blockbuster store closed, Netflix was worth $23.5 billion. So, and I could go on and on. I mean, there's so many stories about how companies fail to see the future. Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975 and decided not to make a product out of it because they were worried it would undercut their film business. Polaroid, most people, unless they're of a certain age, don't remember this, but Polaroid actually had the best-selling digital camera in the world. They decided to stop investing in it, though, because every time they sold more digital cameras, they sold less film, and they made more money off of film. So the solution to that was obviously to stop selling digital cameras. Xerox, as pretty much everybody knows, invented all of the technologies that underlied the personal computer revolution, and yet somehow managed to not make a single dollar off of it. And apparently weren't tipped off when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak offered them $50 million in Apple stock to spend 30 minutes walking through their R&D center. Palm showed us that we all wanted to have a computer in our pocket, but somehow failed to grasp that we also wanted a phone in our pocket. And then Yahoo had an opportunity to buy Google for $25 million, and their response was, why in the world would anyone want another search engine? So, the whole point is to avoid these things. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of aspects to Red TV, but I want to focus specifically, and I'll be done shortly, I promise you, and I'll talk less formally. I want to focus specifically on the futuring tools that are included in the Red Teaming tool set. So one of them is called Alternative Futures Analysis. And this is a tool where you basically create 2 axes of forces that could shape the way a strategy or a plan or just the general environment that you are working in could unfold in the future. And then you look at what the results would be. Now it's similar to scenario planning, but it's different. And the way it's different is at least one of the axes must be something that you have some control over. The reason for that is because Red Teaming is not just about seeing the future, it's about doing something about the future. So let me give you an example. If you were looking at how to, let's just take something right now. If you were Shell Oil and you were walking through Trafalgar Square and were struck by the fact that you were being painted as the devil, then maybe you should rethink your line of business. You could do an exercise where you looked at one axis could be high dependency on fossil fuels going forward to low dependency on fossil fuels going forward. One, high investment by us in alternative energies, one low investment by us in alternative energies. And then you could plot out and spend time looking at what each of those four different futures would look like. And you could create a strategy for Shell that was more likely to work regardless of which future occurred based on moving the lever that you can control. Does that make sense to people? It's a little hard to go over.
So it's a Gartner magic quadrant, effectively.
It is, but it's different than that because there's no right answer. So with Magic Quadrant, you're always trying to get to the upper right-hand corner. And this is this is really about understanding. Look, Shell doesn't ultimately decide whether there's continued use of fossil fuels or not. They have some say in it. So the point of doing this exercise, if you were them, is to say whether their people continue to use fossil fuels or don't. How can we make a strategy that, by changing our investments, which we do control, is likely to succeed in both of these quadrants? Does that make sense? So it's similar but different. And the reason I'm not explaining these in details, it takes a while to teach these in detail. I mean, when we teach this to people, we usually spend a day teaching it to them. I just want to give you a sense of what some of the different tools are. So another one is called what-if analysis. And this is a tool that is designed to explore the impact of an event that might not occur, but would have a major impact if it did. Like if you were a company planning for, say, Brexit, you might want to do an exercise like this. But it's this only really kind of touches on the surface of it, because you don't just look at what would happen if it occurred. You look at what has to happen for it to occur at the same time. And so that gives you some signposts to watch for as the future unfolds to see if it's going to occur, and then it gives you options to follow if it does occur. But probably the most profound tool in this area is a tool called premortem analysis. And premortem analysis is designed to answer the question, what is the worst that could happen? But it doesn't stop there. And I'll explain to you how this tool works, because it's really deceptively simple. It all comes down to contemplating failure. And when I say contemplating failure, I don't mean like saying, well, how would this plan miss its targets? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is let's say let's stick with our Shell example, and let's say you were looking at the strategy for how much money Shell invests in alternative energy solutions. And there's a strategy that you've been asked to red team. Then your job, if you were using premortem analysis, would be to say, let's assume this strategy fails. And it doesn't just fail to adequately invest in the right alternative technologies. It leads us to go out of business. We're bankrupt. It's 5 years from now, and as a result of this strategy, we're bankrupt. Then you work backwards, step by step. How did that happen? What is the thing that broke us, that made us go bankrupt? Okay, we've got that. What is the thing that had to happen for that to happen? What is the thing that had to happen for that to happen? And you work backwards into the present day. If you do that, you get several things. First, and ideally you don't just do it yourself, you do it with a group, like I said. So if you do it with 10 people, you get 10 different failed states, and you walk all of them back to the present, and then you look at them. And what you see inevitably is that there are common points of failure amongst several of the strategies. So for instance, I just did this with one of the largest telecommunications companies in the world. And they were looking at a strategy, and I had 12 people in the group that we were working with. And of those 12 people, 9 of them had 2 bullet points in their pathway to failure that were identical. And so obviously, if you're trying to make the plan better, you want to focus on those 2 points, because there's a lot of ways that those 2 issues could lead to catastrophic failures. The other thing you get from this method is, by then looking at those steps, is you can identify signposts to look for as you unfold a strategy, to say, oh, remember when we did a pre-mortem on this? That was what led to X, and X is what led to Y, and Y was what led to us going out of business. So now that we see this happening, maybe we should pause and adjust and make sure that X doesn't happen, so that Y doesn't happen, so we don't go out of business. Does that make sense? It's a deceptively simple thing, but it's very powerful, and it was developed by this scientist, Dr. Gary Klein, who I've had the opportunity to work very closely with. And this is why he developed it, is this recognition that people, when planning is happening, people are reluctant, even if they have doubts, to say, but couldn't this all fail spectacularly? And not only, and I would go one step beyond what he says here and say that people are reluctant, people also just don't think about how things could go wrong. So if you, just take a very simple example, if you're buying a new car, once you've made the decision, you're going to go car shopping, you've already decided you're going to pay for a new car, you're going to go car shopping, you don't spend your next, you don't spend the next several days thinking about how horrible it's going to be to own a car and what could go wrong and what problems owning a car might cause you. You think, this is going to be great, I'm going to love this car, it's going to be fabulous. You think about all the positives. That's fine, but by doing that, you don't think as much about the potential negatives of things, and you don't prepare for them in that way. That's a very simple example. I was talking with the head of a large private equity company, and he said, the problem with our planning is that we try to look at the future, but once somebody comes to us with a proposal on our team, that we should buy company X for X amount of dollars. I love the way he put it. He says, we become pregnant with the deal. Everybody says, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to make so much money off this, and we start thinking about all the reasons this is going to be wonderful, because when you're pregnant, you don't want to say, well, my baby's going to be ugly, You want to think about how wonderful it's going to be. And so this is designed to force you to think about the ways that things could go wrong, not because you want to not do it, but because you can plan for the future better if you understand the ways it could go wrong right now. So that's just a really short introduction to what red teaming is and how it helps with looking at the future, and I would love to talk to you more if you have any questions about it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Really, really interesting. I'm sure there'll be many questions from the audience in a minute, but are politicians interested in this, or should politicians be interested in this?
This is a very good question. I think that, and I'm just going to be brutally honest, I think that politicians think they're interested in this, but they're not. And I speak from firsthand experience. So after my book came out, I was actually contacted in the United States by a leading person in one of our political parties. And he said, read your book, this is brilliant. He says, we want to red team climate change. I said, that's great. And he said, yes, we're going to get people together from both parties and we're going to red team climate change. And here's what we would like to come out of that. And I said, obviously you didn't read the book very closely. Because if you're already going to present the answer, even if it's the right answer, then you're not red teaming. You're just doing this sort of kabuki dance to make people think they're thinking when they're not actually thinking. And what we try to do, what my company's motto is, don't outsource thinking. We try to help people to think. We don't want to think for them. We don't come and do this for companies. We don't tell them what the future is going to look like. We want to give them tools so that they can figure it out themselves. And politicians, I don't think, and this is what this politician said to me. He said, look, I've been doing this for 30 years. And he said, I will tell you, there is no politician in either party who will ever hold an exercise in which they do not know what the answer is going to be before they do it, because it would be too dangerous. So I think that politicians, unfortunately, though they could benefit from it, don't. However, that doesn't mean that government can. And I will tell you a true story. To write this book, I had to basically take 6 months off from my business and go to play soldier for turn that off. Play soldier for 6 months to go through this program, and that was not a decision I took lightly. I wanted to make sure that this was something that other people found useful besides me. And I was actually on holiday in London, and my wife and I were sitting at a restaurant that used to be in St. James Park, the Inn in the Park, that's now just like a cafe, but it used to be a little bit nicer. And we were having lunch, and there were two tweedy gentlemen sitting at the table next to me. And I don't know what ministry they were from, but one of them was saying, our minister has just decided to expand this effort we call red teaming. And he was explaining it to the other one, and he was saying, we're going to take our plans and we're going to deliberately challenge them And the older gentleman sitting opposite him said, well, this is exactly what we need in all ministry as well. And I kicked my wife under the table. I said, see, people actually really get this. They want it. And so I think governments can use it, but unfortunately, I think politicians, it's anathema to them of all stripes, unfortunately.
If government ministries did say to you, please help us organise red teaming on climate change, I know we can't say what the outcome would be, but what would be involved in that particular exercise?
So I think that most, at least in this country, I think most people are no longer questioning whether climate change is happening, I would presume. I think the question that they would be looking at is what to do about it. And so I think that red teaming can play a really important role there in two ways. One is looking at specific plans that might be put forward to deal with climate change, and looking at the unintended consequences of those plans. So I'll give you an example. Everybody loves electric cars, or at least most people do, and it's a feel-good thing. You have a lot of Hollywood celebrities, who like to tout that they drive electric cars. The problem is that in the United States, it's a country that still gets 50% of its energy from coal. And in a country that still generates 50% of its energy from coal, using an electric car doesn't necessarily reduce the amount of carbon that you generate if that energy is being produced by a coal-fired plant. So that's just a very simple example of how you could make a decision like, let's all switch to electric cars, and actually make the environment worse because you haven't solved the back-end problem, which is where do we generate our electricity from. So that's just a very simple example of, I think, of how you can do it. The other thing that you could do is that, and I mean, this is something I actually have worked with companies and governments around, is this, the sad reality is that a lot of the plans that we make today are going to be impacted by climate change, even if they have nothing to do with climate change. So you have to account for, what is going to, is your plan going to be able to survive a world in which, for instance, I'm from California. I don't know how many of you have heard about what's happening in California in the past 72 hours, but we've had half the state blacked out deliberately because of the threat from wildfires. And the response of the power utility has been to shut the power down because the last two fire seasons have had horrific wildfires because of climate change, and the power utility has been blamed for starting them. So the response this year is we're not going to get blamed again, so we're shutting the power off. Now think about the implications of that, and we're being told, by the way, that this is our new normal. We should now expect this forever now because of the changes to the climate. Well, if that's the new normal, think about the implications to hospitals, which now have to deal with life support equipment for patients being interrupted by power going down. Think about the implications for grocery stores, which now have to deal with perishables. Think about the implications for just individual people who have to deal with the fact that they don't have electricity as a reliable thing that we've come to account on, at least in the first world. So I think you could use it also in making sure that your plans are just, for the changed realities that may come from climate change.
Questions from the floor?
Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions, actually, if I may. Question one is, you speak a lot about planning and trying to improve the idea of planning and challenging assumptions. But it still seems very much focused on doing a lot of planning up front. How does this sit with this sort of new or maybe not so new idea of agile thinking,
yes,
agile methodologies, the ideas that Silicon Valley companies are promoting about embracing failure and sort of dealing in small modular failure and using failure as a mechanism to inform and modify your ideas, rather than trying to come up with all possible scenarios and failures in a planning process. So that's one question.
So let me answer that question. It's a complex question, so I want to make sure I answer that before I answer the second one. So a couple of things on that. So I mentioned to you that so there's really two things that are encompassed in red teaming. When I learned red teaming, it was this very formal process of, like I said, of having a group of people who look at a strategy, look at a plan. And that's what I learned from the military, it's what I learned from the MOD, it's what I learned from the CIA and others that I talked to when I was researching my book. And that doesn't account for that. That is all focused on dealing with the plan before it's executed. In the field, in the past several years, 2 years since my book came out, What I've been finding is that there is a great need for using the same approach, but at a lower level and at a farther out level in terms of real time. And what I mean by that is first of all, I'm a big believer in distributed decision making, and that empowering frontline managers and things like that to make decisions rather than relying on what they've been told, in order to be agile and in order to avoid really obvious mistakes. And so you can teach people some of these tools, not the full tool set, but a light version of these tools, if you will, that they can use informally without a team, or just by grabbing a couple of their colleagues and saying, let's just go and, we encountered this problem, let's figure out a way to solve it right now, and get them together and do a pre-mortem or something like that. So that's one thing. The second thing that I would say, though, at the same time is, it's interesting because I live in Silicon Valley, and there's starting to be a backlash against the whole break things mindset. And that was certainly the mindset up until recently. The problem is there's some people who feel like it's gotten too far now. And I'll give you an example. I haven't seen any around London. I don't know if that's just where I'm at, but you have e-scooters here?
Yeah.
So e-scooters is kind of the case that broke that model in Silicon Valley. So you had these companies come up with this idea of having e-scooters that would just be left on street corners. And because the mindset of Silicon Valley is don't ask for permission, do it and break it, and then figure it out from breaking it, they just started dropping scooters off all over San Francisco. And it was great. And then the city council said, wait a second here, you didn't ask us for permission before you did this. And they seized all the scooters. That was not the bad part. The bad part was then they put a moratorium on scooters. And then they said, in 6 months we will take applications for scooter permits. So the two companies that invented e-scooters now had to watch as 12 other companies were created in those 6 months to duplicate their business model. And guess what happened when they put it out to bid who was going to get licenses? Because the city was upset with them for having not asked for permission in the first place, they did not get permits. So they created a whole new business that they then didn't participate in because, and that has become something that's very talked about in Silicon Valley now, about there's limits to how far you want to go with the whole break stuff model. Maybe we do need to plan things more a little bit.
They didn't do the red teaming.
They didn't. But there's another technology, I will just say, that was very similar to e-scooters that many people thought was going to be the next big thing about 7 years ago. And companies invested billions of dollars in it, and it completely failed. And it failed because nobody asked the question about whether they'd be legal to ride on sidewalks. Sometimes you can get out ahead of yourself too far if you don't plan. But I think you need both. So now, your second question.
The second question
Yeah.
is about having done all this. The implicit assumption, I understand, is that you do something about it, and
Yes.
that goes back to the rational choice theory.
Yes. Well, red teaming only works in organizations where it's allowed to work. So, I would tell you that right now despite the success that they had initially with it, there's not a lot of red teaming going on in the U.S. military because the current regime in charge of the United States doesn't want to hear alternative analysis. And so there were some major red teaming exercises conducted after Trump became president, and the findings were presented to him, and he did not like them. And so at this point, they've just kind of said, well, there's not much point doing this on major strategies, but they still do it on smaller things because the individual generals, can change their thinking based on them. So you have to have, and there's companies too. There's a lot of companies that don't want to think differently. They think that they know all the answers. The CEO is very sure of himself or herself and doesn't want to have alternative analysis to look at. It doesn't work in those environments. One of the things that I was taught when I went to the red teaming university, one of the first lessons was you can't red team in the Führer bunker. And so if you work or are working in an environment where people don't want to look at other options, there's not much point in trying to show them other options. Does that make sense?
Neil. So I was in the consulting world for my sins many years ago, and one of the things I observed was at the strategic level, most executives don't really want to think for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They may pretend to or pay lip service to it, but paying McKinsey or paying a consultancy was a great way of avoiding accountability and making problems someone else's.
Yep.
My concern with this, I see where it works and how it works, but there's a human nature thing where I think fairly universally people are resistant, or there's an element of our psychology that makes us inclined to avoid thinking things through thoroughly.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of goes against that and forces a level of critical thinking that I think is alien to many organizations, many executives. How do you go about rewiring people's thinking and organizational cultures around this? Because a quick program or training course will have localized effects, but to actually change an organization where there's well-entrenched ways of approaching things is going to be quite challenging.
So you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100%. Let me parse that in three ways. Just to your overall point, first of all, one of my favorite Bertrand Russell quotes is that many people would rather die than think. Some do. And actually, it's many. Most people would rather die than think. Many do. And you're absolutely right. It does go deeply against the way that most people are wired, and I think that's why we have the problems we have, is because we are wired that way. It doesn't mean we can't rewire ourselves. And there's a lot of research that's been done lately in the area of neuroplasticity, and there's a lot of interest, I think, including amongst business leaders, in this idea of changing the way we think. It's far from universal. So to get into your specific question about consulting, I couldn't agree more. That's why I said the motto of my company is "Don't outsource thinking." I mean, this is the question that we pose to some of our prospective clients. You have, and this I'm thinking of a specific company that I had this conversation with recently, a very large, well-known multinational corporation. I said, you have 325 people in your organization chart who have the word strategy in their title, and yet you pay McKinsey $12.5 million a year to develop strategy for you. Why is that? I mean, is it because you don't trust those people? Or is it because you've hired the wrong people? Or do you need more than 325 people? Does actually having 337, since you get 12 people from McKinsey, suddenly tip the balance? No, it's because of exactly what you said. People would rather outsource thinking to someone else because then they can blame McKinsey if it goes wrong, or they can say, we just did what McKinsey told us and nobody's going to question that McKinsey knows what they're talking about, even though most of the people who will do the work for you, as you know, for McKinsey, just got out of college, have never spent a day of their life working in an actual company and actually know nothing about strategy that they haven't read in a textbook. So, but that is how many companies operate. The other thing is that, as you probably also know, is that when McKinsey comes into your company, and I'm sorry if there's anyone from McKinsey here, but I don't think they would disagree with us because it would be impossible to, since it's true, is what they do is they interview those 325 people who have the name strategy in their title, and then they go and tell the CEO what they learned from them. But now it's come from McKinsey, so it's obviously true now. And I was talking with one CEO who I told this to, and he laughed. He says, "You're absolutely right." He says, "I never hire a consulting firm unless I know what they're going to tell me." And he says, "I don't hire them because I want them to tell me something. I hire them so I can go to my board of directors and say, Bain told me this, therefore we must do it." But it's stupid. It's just stupid. And why pay someone else to do this when you have talented people who work in your own organization who, if they had the basically, were let loose to actually do this and then were given more tools to do it better, could really make a difference. Which brings me to your third point, which is, you're right, one session does not change a culture. But here's what one session does in many cases. It shows people the value of this, and then they want more. So, the way our typical engagement with a company works out is we find someone who's receptive to this. And they say, come in for a couple days and lead us through an exercise, and we'll see how it goes. And then they see how it goes, and they say, wow, if we could do that in 2 days, what could we do if we had a team of people working on this, for a week? And then they it snowballs. And I will tell you, even in the U.S. military, and this is really interesting because it goes right to what you're saying. The U.S. Army created this program, the Army version of this. They created this program, yes, to stress test their strategies and plans, but that's not the real reason they created it. That was the official reason. The real reason they created this, I mean, if you talk to the people who created it and the generals that signed off on it, was one of the generals told me, I signed off on this because I wanted to create an insurgency within the U.S. Army. I wanted to create a virus that would spread through the entire organization, that would change our culture, because our culture is a culture of not asking tough questions, of not challenging our thinking. And his idea was that because this is done with fairly senior, level officers, you can't get into the program in the U.S. Army unless you're a major. That a good percentage of the people who go through this program will become colonels, and a good percentage of those colonels will ultimately become generals. And over time, you will then end up with this entire senior leadership, or a significant percentage of the entire senior leadership of the military, run by people who've been through this training, who have these applied critical thinking skills, and who have this perspective of challenging things and not just accepting things. And that over time will be amazingly transformative. And the best companies that I've worked with have the same mindset about this. They're doing this because it gives them better strategies and plans today, but they're putting people in our program who are on their high potential list, who they know will get promoted, so that within 5 or 10 years, they'll reach a point where the senior leadership of the company has all been trained in this. And that's how you change culture.
Just a question of the future, or perhaps the present. How do you see AI aligning with red teaming?
It's a fabulous question.
Sorry about that.
No, it's great. It's one of my favorite questions, and it's something I've actually thought. I've thought a lot about it. And the best, I love giving book recommendations. Not required reading, no test, but Machine Platform Crowd. If you haven't read it,
No.
it's a fabulous book. I believe it came out last year. And
Eric Brinchelsson and Andrew McAfee, Machine Platform Crowd. I echo the recommendation as well.
Thank you.
so, as you know, the fundamental thesis of this book is that everybody's missing the point when it comes to AI and robotics. It's not a binary situation where you're going to have AIs replace people and robotics replace people. That the opportunity, the real opportunity, is AI working under people. People using AI to make better decisions. So, think about stock picking. You already have, this is not science fiction, this is not futurism. You already have AIs right now that can consistently do a better job with picking stocks than the best minds on Wall Street. And that's great. You can replace all of these high-paid stockbrokers with AIs. But that's not where the real opportunity is. The real opportunity is then to couple that with a couple of really skilled fund managers who say, we're going to create a green fund to support emerging energy technologies. And we're going to lead this because we have a vision of how to use investments to shape the future of the world in a positive direction. We're going to have the AIs pick the actual stocks, but we're going to guide them. We're going to put rails on them so that they pick stocks that align with this strategy. So that they're making good economic choices, but they're making them within a framework of steering things, because that's what the AI is not good at, is kind of working on complex problems. It's really good at anything that has a right and a wrong answer to. So instead of saying pick the best stocks, what their opportunity is to say, here's a list of 10,000 companies that are doing green energy. Pick the best stocks in this group. Then the machine picks the best stocks in that, but then they manage that list. And so you see, then you get the benefit of the AI, but you get the vision of the humans. And I think that is true in a lot of areas. So, AIs can help with red tape, but an AI is still not going to be able to tell you all the ways a plan is going to fail. It can tell you what the probabilities of various things happening are and stuff like that. It's still not going to be able to tell you all the ways a plan can fail. And so you still have a need for red teaming in that. The other thing is that you also have one of the biases of this, there's automation bias, which is something that people are becoming increasingly concerned about, because as people become more reliant on AIs, they become less likely to challenge the AI's results. And you've already seen this happen on Wall Street about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. A firm that was an early adopter in automated trading unleashed a smart system that within the first week lost them over 150 million pounds because the machine started making bad choices, but nobody caught it because the machine couldn't be wrong. And so even though somebody at the firm said, sir, this is not right, you have a bachelor's degree, it's an AI, get out of its way. So you need, I think it's an open question, but I think you still need both.
Thank you.
Matthew?
Yeah, I like what I heard, but I've got this sort of an innate worry or concern that it comes from the military.
Mm-hmm.
And so, throughout history we've had universities with sociology departments and psychology departments and some great sociological thinkers, Pinker, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Haven't all these kind of ways of human thinking already been thought about? And is maybe one of the biases that you're missing on your list there, the military thinking bias?
So I think that's a good point. There's a couple things. One is the tools, I think, are not products of the military thinking necessarily. A lot of it is really just applied critical thinking. What the military has done in this case is, and I think if you look at the tools in detail, you see very little evidence of military thinking in them, because what they were designed to do is challenge military thinking. This was a reaction to recognize. I mean, very very clearly, in the United States, this was created to counter what's called MDMP, the military decision-making process, which is the formal military way of thinking of how you find an answer. And the MOD has a similar process that they use red teaming to counter as well. So it was created to counter that. And the reason I think that is valuable is a couple of things. One is all large organizations tend to become hierarchical. And so one of the things we didn't really get into is that under all of these tools, there's a lot of tools that are groupthink mitigation tools that are basically designed to create pathways of generating anonymous feedback and anonymous input to the red teaming process to break through the hierarchy. And the reason I say that's valuable is a lot of times when I tell companies about this, they say, well, it's going to be hard for people to speak up, to senior management and stuff. So I'm not sure this is going to work. And my response is your organization more hierarchical than the military? No, but, well, okay, then give it a shot because it works there. And if it can work there, it can work in your organization. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. This is a true story. So in the U.S. Army, when red teaming started to take off, there was a major red teaming exercise that was conducted around a major part of U.S. global military strategy. And the team that was assembled included everyone from a lieutenant's probably 24, 25, 26 years old, to a 4-star general, which is the most senior general in the U.S. military. And there was people from every gradation in between. And one of the very simple groupthink mitigation tools that we teach is simply involves dot voting. So, and it's part of a tool we call key assumptions check. So they took the strategy and they, as a group, kind of broke it down into what are the assumptions that underlie the strategy. And they listed all of them. They came up with 87 assumptions that underlay the strategy. They wrote them all on a large board. And then they gave people a certain number of dot stickers to go up and vote for which strategy they thought would be the most likely to fail. What assumption within the strategy would be most likely to fail? And they figured out 3 points of failure, and they figured it out with everyone from the lowest ranking lieutenant to the highest ranking general cast their votes. But they didn't stop there. They then said, what are we going to do about the fact that we've identified these points of failure that are likely to fail? So they did another tool we call weighted anonymous feedback. And the way weighted anonymous feedback works, and it's very low tech, and there's reasons for it, which I can explain if anyone's interested. is you give everyone in the room an index card. And you say, write your best idea for changing the strategy to overcome this defect we've all identified on this card in block letters so that no one can recognize anyone else's writing. You go through a series, it's a little bit complicated where you kind of do a party trick, where you pass the cards around and then you look at them and you write a score of 1 to 5 on it. 1 is, this is the worst idea I've ever heard in my life. 5 is, this is exactly what we need to solve this problem. And you go around the group 5 times. And when you go around the group 5 times, you get a good representative sample of what people think of that idea. So they did this, and they did this on each of the points of failure, and they did it over the course of a couple of days. When they were done, they came up with 3 major recommendations that they were going to change the strategy based on these 3 recommendations. And they were getting ready to go present it, but the 4-star general in the group said, okay. Now I know this is all supposed to be anonymous, and I want to respect the process and everything. I'm not going to ask anybody who came up with the dumb ideas that we didn't vote for. One of them was mine. But he said, I want to know who came up with the 3 ideas that we're going to go to the President of the United States and say we need to change these 3 things. Very sheepishly, this 25-year-old lieutenant raised his hand. And he said, son, which one of those did you come up with? He said, all 3. And the general apparently said, I'm not going to lie to you, son. If you'd come up to me and told me those ideas and I saw the 1 bar on your shoulder, I would have told you to go back and, peel some potatoes. So that's just one example of how this is designed to actually break through the hierarchical thinking that is endemic in militaries in all countries and to think differently about it.
Just from that, we've been working with a company following that mentality. It's a company called Enswarm, and they've built a tool that allows this anonymous input. So we can share a question to the room here, we can share it across 5,000 people globally. And it brings all the comments in weights and scores, and we can all weight and score each other's. And at the end of it, then this gives the general, the CEO, of all these questions and inputs, the top 3 answers or questions would be X, Y, Z. And it's all totally anonymous until you then hit the final print button. Then it comes up and tells you who's put all the input and output. So companies using this now to actually have it as an award and reward throughout the year for people's personal performance management. But also it does take away that things, you go to the CEO with a great idea, you are immediately judged on where you are, what your background is, what your experience is, and you can have the most phenomenal idea and it just gets dismissed. It goes back to the meetings as well, having meetings with the hippo, the highest paid person in the room. If the general sticks at that idea first, everyone's going to go, yeah, great idea, general, because my bonus is going to be dependent on that, or my report's been getting into next week. So it's hugely influential.
Now the MOD has taken this to an even deeper level that I think is great, except it takes more time. And they have a policy, when they receive a plan to Red Team, they have a team on the Red Team who rewrite the policy, who basically map it out. And the reason they do this is because, going back to cognitive biases, if you receive a plan from somebody that's written by a team that's very eloquent and understands, how to make a powerful case for what they're doing, people are going to be more likely to believe it. But you may have a better idea that's written by somebody who's not very eloquent, who doesn't have a great command of language and doesn't do a great job of presenting it. So they first filter it through this team that basically maps it all out, and then they analyze that, not the original plan, so that they're not biased by how good the plan looked to begin with. So there's a lot of things that you can do and that are part of this that are designed to very much challenge that type of thinking.
So Bryce, you're giving now some positive examples of when this has worked.
Yes.
And I think there must be many companies who would be quite interested in maybe experimenting, but they're afraid of what we've talked about, that in their organisation people aren't allowed to think freely. Can you point to more positive examples of companies who have done the opposite from all their failures? You had a whole bunch of failures, companies who got stuck in their thinking. Can you share some positive examples, whether by red teaming or by some other mechanisms, companies were able to change their thinking, and therefore this might be evidence which a middle manager in a company who wanted to bring you in could then take to their bosses and say, look, it is possible. Other companies have been able to change and have avoided the fates of Kodak and so on.
Yeah, so I can't talk in great detail about companies we've worked with because we're kind of bound to not discuss, because usually these things are very strategic and they're still unfolding. We've only been doing this in earnest for 2.5 years, so most of the strategies that we've looked at are still unfolding right now. But we have had many companies that have had major strategies that they have decided not to pursue after having red teamed them and to go back to the drawing board basically, or to abandon them altogether. And we have others that are moving forward with strategies that they've changed substantially because of red teaming and they feel are more likely to succeed. But one example that I'll talk about that I think very much goes to this, that because it is in the public domain and it is something that people can talk about, is one of my theses that I talk about in my book is that none of this is new. This is a lot of the most disruptive companies in the world, the companies that people admire and stuff. This is how they operate organically. This is really a tool that's designed for companies that struggle to do that. So I'll give you an example, 2 examples. One is, again, like I said, I didn't take the decision to do this lightly, and so I bounced this idea. One of the people I bounced this off several people. One of them was a senior executive at Amazon. And I told him, I said, I'm thinking of doing this. I would have to, quit my job, go to the military for 6 months to learn this, Here's the tools that I've learned that I will learn from them. And I went over a half a dozen of them with him, and he was really interested, and he said, we do all of those things. He says, we don't call it red teaming, but everything you just described there, and we don't have quite as formal a process for it. He says, this is how we run. This is how Amazon runs. And he says, this is someone who'd been at the company since the very beginning. He said, this goes back to when we were working out of a small warehouse in Seattle. Jeff had a system in place where we were required to look at our own operations on a regular basis and to say, how could this be done differently? If we were a competitor of Amazon and wanted to best Amazon in this, what would we do to put Amazon out of business? We do it to ourselves. We become our own worst enemy. And that's how come nobody's done it to us, is because we've already sabotaged ourselves. So when someone comes and tries to compete with Amazon, we've already done that. He says, we've already thought about that. And he says, the thing that I like about what you just described is, he says, I'm asked at conferences all the time by other companies, how can we be more like Amazon? And he says, I always feel like a jerk, because he says, the only thing I've ever thought to tell them is, well, you could start over. He says, because it's so deeply ingrained in our DNA that this is how we operate. He says, but he said, this system that you've described of red teaming, this is something a company that isn't Amazon could do and could learn and could get some of that same thing. He said, I don't know if they'd go all the way to be Amazon. He said, I'm not going to give it that. But he said, it would make them a lot more like Amazon if they did that. So that's one thing. But a specific example that I love to share, because I think it's a great example of red teaming in action, even though, again, it predates red teaming. But one of my theses is that the best leaders are natural-born red teamers. And one person that a lot of people admire in business is Steve Jobs. There's a story in Walter Isaacson's book about when Steve Jobs first came back to Apple after he'd been fired famously. And the first thing that Jobs did is, can we raise the screen? Is that possible?
Yes, sure. Or we can turn it off.
Well, actually, I wanted to use the whiteboard.
Want to use a whiteboard?
Yeah.
I've got a board here.
Oh, okay, brilliant. So Steve Jobs, first thing he did when he came back to Apple was he asked for a review of all the products that Apple was currently making, because he hadn't been following terribly closely, because he was pretty bitter about the fact he'd been kicked out of the company that he founded. And I don't know how many of you will remember this, but in the mid-90s, when Steve Jobs came back as CEO of Apple, Apple was making 13 different computers. I don't mean 13 different levels of the Macintosh. It was making 13 different products. And so Jobs said, that's interesting. I'd like to understand why we're making 13 different products. And he asked that the head of each product program come in and spend half a day explaining to him what the product was, what its point was, what its place in the market was, and why Apple was making it. And he managed to sit through 3 of these, a day and a half. In the midst of the 4th one, he got up and apparently, because he was not the nicest person interpersonally, literally pushed the guy who was presenting out of the way. And he said, I don't want to hear any more of these. And he drew, he had one, this was appears to be dead. Perfect. He drew a quad chart, of course. And he said, he wrote, desktop, mobile, business, personal. And he was red in the face when he was doing this, apparently, too, people in the room said. And he said, tell me what the best product that we make in each of these 4 segments is. What is the best mobile business computer we make? What is it? Tell me right now. And he wrote it down. He said, okay, it's the, MacBook, whatever. He said, what is the best business desktop we make? He wrote it down. He said, what is the best? He said, when he got the list, he said, every other product is killed right now. It's dead. I don't want it. I want to call the factories, stop production. They're dead as of right now, this minute. He said, these are the only 4 segments of the market that matter. Our job is to produce the best computer in each of these segments.
So what was the 4th segment?
So it's business and personal, desktop and mobile. And that is a extreme example of red teaming in action, because presumably the people who had developed each of these products had thought very deeply about why Apple needed product number 11 and 12 and 13. And presumably they'd made very compelling cases to Apple's leadership about why they needed to invest in them. But Steve Jobs hadn't sat through any of those meetings. He came in with a fresh set of eyes, without the biases that the people who had been involved in those meetings had, and he was able to say, look, why do we make 13 different computers? There's only 4 segments of the market. We make 4 best computers that we could possibly make in those segments, and that's problem solved. So that's another example of red teaming in action. That's exactly what Apple went on to do, and that's how they saved themselves on the computer business.
Can you apply red teaming to red teaming? I'd like you to talk about what you've learned, what were the assumptions that you had about the process that turned out wrong, what were the lessons?
You can and you should. So, and we do. So, one of the things that I teach is that you have to red team yourself too. And you also have to red team your red team. So in the military, I'm going to answer this at several different levels. So in the military, for instance, red teaming is not allowed to become a tenured position. You cannot serve more than 2 years on a red team. And then you have to have another assignment. I don't know if that's true in the British military, but it's in the US military. Yeah. And it's designed because otherwise the red team creates its own biases and its own groupthink and all of this. So with our corporate clients that have red teams, formal red teams, we constantly have a training program going on so that every year they're moving people off of the red team and putting new people on the red team for the same reason. Now there's a secondary virtue of that, which goes back to the point that I was making about creating the insurgency or the virus within the organization. Is the more you move people through, the more people get trained in it, and they go and take red teaming back to their organization. So that's a good thing. In terms of my personal learnings, there's been several. One of them is that when I started my company just over 2 years ago, I assumed that 70 to 80% of our business would be doing what we call red teaming facilitation, which is we don't do red teaming for people, but we do go into companies and say, company has a major strategy that they want to look at. We will figure out what tools they should use to look at it, and we won't teach them the tools. We'll lead them through an exercise using the tools so that they can make a better decision. I thought that would be 70 to 80% of what we did. And then I thought the rest would be a small number of companies would want to actually have red teams and want us to train them. Turned out that equation was completely reversed. The vast majority of companies that we've worked with have wanted us to train their in-house red teams, which was a pleasant surprise, but a challenging one too. But the biggest the biggest epiphany that I've had, and it's something that I've only come to in the past this year, is I was because I saw how valuable having a separate team was, I was very fixated on formal red teaming. You know, this idea that the only way to do this is to have a group of people whose job is going to be to look at this with a fresh set of eyes who weren't involved in developing the original strategy, and to look at that. I realized that I don't disagree. I still believe that's true, but I also believe that it's very impractical for a lot of organizations. A lot of organizations, I'll give you an example. I mean, we work with one Wall Street bank who told us, look, we would love to have a standing red team, but everyone who we can think of who we would want to be on that red team is somebody who literally makes millions of dollars for this organization every single day. So the cost of creating that red team is not just paying you to train them. It's the fact that every day they spend red teaming. If there's 10 people on the red team and they each make $3 to $5 million for the company every day, then we're losing $30 to $50 million every day they're red teaming. It's not an insignificant problem. So I have become much more focused in the past few months, and I'm actually working on a new book on this topic, on what we call red team thinking. And the reason we call it red team thinking is because it's taking some of the thinking behind red teaming, but presenting it in a format that people can use individually or in small groups informally to make better decisions in the moment, rather than going through a formal red teaming process. It's not a replacement for red teaming. It's not as rigorous as red teaming, but it's more rigorous than not doing anything at all. And so I'm trying, it took me a while to get over the whole don't let the great be the enemy of the good type of thing. And we're finding companies are a lot more receptive to that too, because it's much easier for them to figure out how to do that. And then what we're starting to see is companies that say, okay, we can do that. They see how effective that is. It makes it easier for them to start to make the case internally about maybe we should actually have a red team, because we see how effective it is just doing it informally like this. Think of how much better it would be if we had a formal process.
Thank you.
Sure.
I want to come back to
Yeah.
my original question,
Yes.
which is, can we have politicians who actually will get with the flow and to do this? And you kindly gave some examples of businesses who have the right kind of thinking. You mentioned Apple and Amazon, and Amazon is surely a great example. Are there any examples of politicians anywhere in the world that seem to be demonstrating this behaviour that we can point to? We might despair at some of the politicians in our nearer vicinities perhaps, but are there some that we could highlight as an example that's more admirable and more promising?
So there is one that has struck me tremendously. Lee Kuan Yew.
From Singapore.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
So and I had the pleasure of spending some time in Singapore last year, and I had lunch with a couple of people who were associates of Lee Kuan Yew's from the beginning, and I didn't know the whole history of Singapore, and they explained it to me, and they explained it to me about how some of the decisions were made, and I was so struck about what a red teaming approach to politics was. So for people like me who don't know, or I didn't know about the kind of origins of Singapore, I'll give you just a brief crash course in it and why I say that it's an example of red teaming. So Singapore did not want to split off from Malaysia. When Britain pulled out of Malaya, Singapore assumed that it was going to stay part of Malaya. But Singapore was much more heavily ethnically Chinese than the rest of Malaya. And so the leaders of Malaya, who were going to be taking over and creating Malaysia, decided that they didn't want to have to deal with this power base in the south of the country that was of a different ethnic group that might, make internal politics much more complicated. So they decided to jettison Singapore at the moment they gained their independence from Britain. And this happened with very little warning. A matter of weeks or days, I don't remember exactly, and someone can correct me who knows, but it was very little warning. And so Lee Kuan Yew was the leader of the community in what's now Singapore. And he gathered a meeting of people together, and he said, look, we have to figure this out right now. because we are an island with no industry, with no arable land, with no fisheries even, which I didn't know. We have zero chance of existing as an independent nation unless we figure out right now two things, and this is where you start to get another red teaming. What possible future do we have where we could be economically viable as an independent country? And then this is where this just gave me chills when I heard this because it's so red teaming action. What are the things that would destroy that? So he apparently on a piece of paper, and this piece of paper is very famous because he then went on later the next day to show it on national television. He wrote down. They came up with a vision. They said we have one option. We obviously can't build anything. We can't grow anything. We can't create any commodities to sell. So the only possible way forward we have is to become the banking center of Asia. We have to become a banking center, a business center, and that's something we can do because we already have banks here and stuff, and it's the only thing we can do. So they said, what would we need to do that? And they came up with a list of things that they would have to do. They'd have to have very clear laws on governance and things like this, and very stable banks. They said, okay, we've got that out. This is where you get into the real red team. Lee Kuan Yew then said, what would destroy that? And he didn't just say, he said, what are the 4 things that would destroy that? If we assume that we managed to do what we said we could do, assume our long shot only option pays off and it happens, how would we destroy that? So he did a pre-mortem analysis, if you think about it. And what they came up with was corruption would destroy it. If we were a corrupt country, then no one would trust us with their money. 2, ethnic and religious unrest would destroy it. They had a conversation with themselves. They said they realized that there are 4 ethnic groups and 4 religious groups in Singapore. So the country is made up of ethnic Chinese, ethnic Indians, ethnic Malays, and then what they call Eurasians, which is everyone from British expats who didn't leave to people of mixed race. And then they have 4 religions. They are Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. And so he and his team said, if that's the case, then we have to make it as serious a crime as murder to incite religious or ethnic unrest or hatred within this country. So they passed a whole slew of laws immediately that basically criminalized any attempt to turn one group against the other group, and also created a whole series of steps to make everybody it's the word I'm looking for, not just tolerate, but to embrace the diversity of the country. And I don't remember what the other 2 things were. There were 2 other things. But the point was, Lee Kuan Yew then went on television at the day of independence and held this piece of paper up and told everyone, this is what, we don't have options. We don't have any options. We have one way forward for this country. So we all have to agree that this is the way forward. And then here is how we destroy this. So we're going to have to do some things that some people may not like in order to make sure these 4 things don't happen. Because if they happen, then this one option is not going to be an option either. And if you look at Singapore today, I mean, it's an economic miracle. And the fact that they did this in such short order with no options other than the one that they pursued, I think is a real sign of how politicians could use red teaming. But I think it's rare.
There was a recent Radio 4 program about that, which covers all of that. Everybody's interested.
Did I get it mostly right?
Yeah. And also, anecdotally, he didn't want any statues of him after his death.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
So he's killing the idea of personality cult.
Yes, absolutely.
We're almost out of time, but we'll take the question.
Following up on that question, would this form of thinking and this tool be more useful in not politicians and the governments, but high-profile organizations in the public sector? Let's say the Treasury or HMRC, FCA, PRA, like these bodies. Because let's face it, these bodies are always relevant. Governments are ephemeral. I mean, they come and go in rates.
Absolutely. We were just having a conversation yesterday with the Major Projects Association, and we were talking about how important red teaming could be to working on huge projects like HS2. you know, and the Thames water projects and things like that. In fact, that's we actually haven't done anything with them yet, but we actually were contacted by Thames Water, my company, to work with them on red teaming their strategies around dealing with climate change and other issues. And so I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of public organizations that could really benefit from this and could use it with great effect, regardless of what the political environment may or may not be.
Quick question. I'm just struck by the fact there appears one of the elements in the success of this, if we can call that, is the speed. So the examples that you've given are people who've worked at speed, and their decision making has been at speed. And of course that's contrary to the way that a lot of organisations work, and indeed, civil services as well. So I don't know. It's just an observation there.
You're right. I mean, and one of the things that I learned in the military and that we teach our clients is that red teaming can never become an excuse for inaction. And it's something you have to guard against when you are doing red teaming, because you're adding another set of analysis. And for it to not be in it, for it not to create new problems, it has to be done at speed. And it has to not be allowed to become professional navel gazing, which, it's very easy to do if you're not careful. So I think it is important to do it at speed.
Final point, Mark.
If we're optimizing the likes of Google and Amazon and the armies and all of those types of organizations, then inherently there's in business antitrust that they're going to outgain themselves and buy up all the competition, and then there is no competition, and then they themselves become the problem possibly for the rest of the world. With that in mind, how do we affect red teams to do good?
It's all, you have to red team the red teams then. I think you're getting into core issues about the fundamental value or lack thereof of capitalism that I think are beyond the purview of.
And fighting.
Yeah,
we're going to the pub shortly, so
Yeah,
we may want to discuss
The red team, the red queen effect.
There you go. Exactly. Yeah, but I mean, I think that I think if you were a company though, if I was Amazon right now, looking at what's happening in the United States on both sides of the political spectrum, interestingly, right now, where you have a president who's mad at Amazon for a variety of personal reasons and wants to break them up, and you have a leading opposition candidate who's mad at Amazon for very different reasons and wants to break them up. If I was Amazon right now, I would be red teaming my business decisions about how could my next acquisition increase the likelihood that I'm going to be broken up because I'm leaning too far in, so to speak. So, yeah.
And just to stay with Mark's question, if people are worried that Amazon and Apple already have too much power and that these techniques may make them even more powerful, the answer is to be able to apply them to the non-governmental organizations and others that are doing more ethical work.
Yeah, and if those of you who want to come to the pub and talk later, I will be happy to share a story of how one of the most effective uses of red teaming was actually done by an NGO in polio eradication.
Yeah. So some possible follow-ups. First of all, there are some books.
We have a few, yes.
You've got a few.
Yeah.
You've got a few copies there. So, and if somebody wants to buy them, what price are you selling them for today?
Whatever it says on the back in pounds.
15.
For the paperback, and how much for the hardback?
No, so 10 for the paperback and 15 for the hardback.
Right. And you might autograph them if you're persuaded.
Yeah.
And just if other people want to follow up, so obviously Bryce is here for a few days. You can find him online.
Yes.
Paul, what's your connection here?
I think are we all heading over the?
No, not everybody's going to go to the pub. Some people have got.
Some of us may head to the bar.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you can look up the Strategic Management Forum.
Strategic Management Forum, where you look at a bunch of similar issues about how to make sure value comes to the fore rather than just
exactly. And we've got
traditional
a LinkedIn group.
Yeah.
It's the Strategic Management Forum. There'll be some articles and references to Bryce's work on there as well.
And we have redteamthinking.com.
Redteamthinking.com.
Yeah.
And you want to say a little bit about what you're doing?
Yeah, so I've known Bryce for over a year now. Previous connections with working in the US military. I was in the service, did a tour over the US Marines, did red team thinking, did that in the UK military, and then left 6-7 years ago and have been working with multiple companies looking at how you take the speed of what's required for the agile ways of working, from the front end doing that development and the cutting edge of the business all the way back to that leadership level. And just the last couple of years, the Business Agility Institute have highlighted that the number of digital transformations failing is 70% plus per year, and the number one cause is leadership. And so it's not the front end doing what it should be doing, it's the back end not enabling the front end to do it as fast and as capable as it could. And having that Bryce previously, this concept is something we're bringing into all the large organisations we work with, to take it from that top end all the way down to that far end, and layering this red team concept and thinking, as Bryce said, at all the levels. It's not the CEO and the C-suite, that lowest dev team thinking in this way and challenging up each way and allowing that thought to be processed all the way up to where the strategy gets made is having huge impact in companies, and enabling that cultural change and mindset shift is what's going to make the big bonuses going forward for companies, I think.
And just before we wrap up, a little bit about the future. We have lots of other events coming up with London Futurists. The one in November is going to be the future of quantum computing. It's a field that's changing quite rapidly. It's very hard to get our heads around what's happening, so we have somebody who has just produced a large report on quantum computing by interviewing almost every significant player in the field. Peter Morgan, some of you may have seen in previous London Futurist events. As an audience member, he'll be giving a talk on actually the past, the future, the past, the present and the future of quantum computing. And then in December, we have a talk by a professor from Oxford University's Department of Physics. She's a professor of biological physics. It's her view that nanotechnology is poised to move into a new era. We've had nanotechnology for a long time, but what's going to be possible pretty soon is going to be significantly different from what's been already possible. So that's by Sonia Contera. Keep your eye on the London Futurists meetup page for other announcements. I want to thank Bryce very much for giving such a fascinating talk, lots of examples. Some of them I knew before, some of them I hadn't, and I'm going to be reading up more about them. I echo his endorsement of Super Forecasters as well by Philip Tetlock. That's a remarkable book as to how people in the real world need to have particular minds. And of course, I recommend you look at his own book. So let's give a warm thanks to Bryce.
Thank you for all your wonderful questions, really great questions. Thank you.
Welcome.